Victor Hale built his life on one belief: if you control the details, you control the outcome. He didn't leave things to chance, he removed it. Every decision was deliberate, every routine had a purpose, nothing was random, and for years, everything worked exactly as expected. Until one day, something didn't. Not a failure, not a mistake, just a result. He couldn't explain. Victor Hale controlled everything: his time, his environment, his decisions. Nothing in his life was left to chance. Every move he made had a reason behind it. And for years, it worked. Until one day, something small went wrong, and he couldn't explain it. Victor Hale didn't believe in luck, not because he thought it didn't exist, but because he had never needed it. By the age of 46, he had built a life that ran with precision. Every morning started the same way. Same time, same routine, same sequence, not out of habit, out of control. Before we go further, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you enjoy stories like this. Victor believed that if you controlled the system, you controlled the outcome. So he removed anything unpredictable. His schedule was fixed, his environment was structured. Even the people around him were carefully chosen. Nothing was random, nothing was left to chance. And because of that, nothing ever went wrong. He woke before sunrise, not because he needed more hours in the day, but because he preferred the world before it became noisy. There was clarity in the early morning. No interruptions, no demands, no variables introduced by other people, just structure. His bedroom remained exactly as he left it the night before. Nothing draped over a chair, nothing out of place on a table, nothing left unfinished. His watch sat in the same position every night. His shoes remained aligned beneath a low bench by the wall. Even the curtains opened at the same pace, letting in just enough light to wake the room without disrupting it. To most people, these would seem like small details. To Victor, they were part of a larger equation. He understood something many people never think about. Disorder is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It starts quietly. A delay, a distraction, a decision made with incomplete focus. One small break in rhythm leads to another, and before long, the day is no longer being directed. It is being reacted to. Victor refused to live that way. He dressed with efficiency. Dark suit, white shirt. Nothing chosen for attention, everything chosen for consistency. He had no interest in standing out through style. His confidence came from something else: predictability, not the kind that made him boring, the kind that made him reliable. When he entered the kitchen, his coffee was already prepared. Not by accident, not by luck. It was part of a sequence that had been set into motion before he ever stepped into the room. The cup was placed on the same side of the counter. The temperature was exact, no sugar, no variation. He didn't treat routine as comfort. He treated it as a controlled starting point. That was the difference. Most people think routine exists to make life easier. For Victor, routine existed to make decisions cleaner. If the beginning of the day is stable, everything that follows can be evaluated with greater accuracy. He never wasted energy on choices that didn't matter. He preserved it for the moments that did. Even silence had purpose in his life. No television in the background, no music competing for attention, no meaningless noise filling the room. He believed distraction was expensive. It cost focus, it weakened observation, and it made people miss things they should have seen. Victor built his life to reduce that cost. By the time he left home each morning, he had already established control over the first part of his day. Nothing had been improvised, nothing had been left open. He didn't rush. He moved at a steady pace, the kind that comes from never feeling late, because lateness itself had already been designed out of his routine. His car arrived at the same time each morning. The route never changed unless he wanted it to. He preferred familiar roads, not because he lacked curiosity, but because familiarity reduced uncertainty. The less unpredictability in the background, the easier it was to focus on what mattered. On the ride to work, he didn't scroll through headlines absent-mindedly. He didn't waste time glancing at information that had no immediate use. And he reviewed only what was necessary: financial reports, meeting briefs, decision points for the day ahead. Everything filtered. Everything selected. He had no interest in consuming more information than he needed. He wanted accurate information, relevant information, useful information. That mindset shaped every part of his success. By the time Victor arrived at the office, the day had already been organized in his mind. He knew where attention needed to go. He knew which conversations mattered. He knew which decisions could not be delayed. There was very little improvisation in the way he approached work, and that was exactly why he moved through it so effectively. His office reflected the same philosophy as his home: minimal, ordered, intentional. There were no decorative distractions, no clutter on his desk, and no stacks of forgotten documents waiting to be reviewed later. Everything in that room had a place, and everything that remained in the room remained there for a reason. Even the layout mattered. The desk faced outward toward the city, but not in a way that suggested vanity. It was about perspective. He liked being able to see distance. It helped him think beyond immediate movement. The chairs were arranged with precision. The lighting was soft but exact. Natural light was preferred where possible, but never allowed to interfere with the work itself. People often misunderstand environments like that. They think order is about aesthetics. It isn't. Order is about speed. When everything is where it should be, you spend less time compensating, less time searching, less time correcting. The mind moves faster when it doesn't need to recover from unnecessary disorder. Victor knew that, so he built spaces that matched the way he thought. That same logic extended into the company he led. By then, his reputation had become something people spoke about carefully. Not because he was feared in the theatrical sense. He wasn't explosive. He wasn't impulsive. He didn't humiliate people for effect or raise his voice to establish authority. What made him difficult to ignore was something much quieter. He noticed what others missed. That changed the way people behaved around him. When Victor entered a room, conversations became tighter. People chose their words more carefully, not because they were nervous in the usual sense, but because they understood that vagueness would not survive contact with him. If a number was weak, he would see it. If a plan lacked structure, he would hear it in the explanation before the slide deck even changed. He didn't interrupt people often. That was part of what made him effective. He let them speak long enough to reveal whether they actually understood what they were saying. Some did, some didn't. The difference became obvious very quickly. And once it became obvious, Victor didn't need to say much. A single question was usually enough. Not a complicated question, not a dramatic one, just the right one. The kind that exposed whether a person had built their thinking on clarity or assumption. That's why meetings under Victor felt different from meetings anywhere else. They were shorter, yes, but that wasn't the real difference. The real difference was that everything irrelevant disappeared very quickly, and people learned not to arrive with half-formed ideas. They learned not to hide weak reasoning behind confident delivery. They learned that precision was not optional, and over time, that changed the culture around him. The company became sharper, not louder, not colder, sharper. Teams communicated more clearly, reports became cleaner, delays became less frequent because people were forced to think more carefully before acting. Victor didn't need to pressure people constantly. The system itself did most of the work. That was always his real strength. He didn't want to control every person individually. He wanted to build a structure that made the right behavior more likely. And once that structure was in place, it sustained itself. That's the point most people never understand about control. They think it means force, constant pressure, endless supervision. But the strongest form of control is almost invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It works by shaping the environment so well that most people follow the right path without ever realizing how limited their alternatives were. Victor never described it that way. He wouldn't have needed to. He simply believed that when systems are built correctly, outcomes improve. And in his experience, they did. That belief shaped how he viewed almost everything. When others saw chaos, Victor looked for sequence. When others saw a bad quarter, he looked for the earlier decision that made it inevitable. When others blamed circumstances, he looked for the point where structure failed. He had very little patience for the phrase, "these things happen." To him, that sentence usually meant someone had stopped thinking too early. Because in Victor's world, things did not just happen. They developed. They followed a chain. And if you could trace that chain back far enough, you could understand the result before it fully arrived. That ability made him powerful, but it also made him certain, not arrogant. Certain. There's a difference. Arrogance refuses to look. Certainty believes it already has. Victor had spent years building a life that confirmed his thinking. His routines worked, his decisions worked, his systems worked. Even when problems appeared, they were usually solved quickly because the underlying cause could be found and corrected. That pattern repeated often enough that confidence became foundational. He didn't expect things to fall apart because, in his experience, they rarely did. And when they showed signs of strain, he usually caught them early enough to prevent real damage. That's why his personal life followed the same rules as his professional one. He didn't make impulsive social choices. He didn't let random personalities drift too close. He kept his circle selective, not because he disliked people, but because he understood how much disorder the wrong person could introduce. He preferred clarity in human relationships just as much as he preferred it in business. You always knew where you stood with Victor, or at least you knew the version of him he allowed you to stand near. That was enough for most people. It's important to understand this because Victor's life was not empty. It was not bleak. It was not lonely in the exaggerated way people often imagine when they hear about control. He was successful. He was respected. His system worked for him. That's what made what happened next matter so much. If his life had already been unstable, the inconsistency would have felt predictable. But it wasn't. It appeared inside a life that had been built specifically to prevent that kind of thing. And that's what gave it weight. For years, Victor had no reason to question his approach. Everything reinforced it. Every successful quarter, every efficient meeting, every resolved issue, every day that ended the way it had been planned. Confidence doesn't become dangerous because it appears suddenly. It becomes dangerous because it goes unchallenged for too long. Victor wasn't careless. He didn't stop paying attention. But he did begin to trust that his system was complete, that if something mattered, it would reveal itself, that if a problem existed, the structure he had built would expose it early enough to be contained. That belief stayed with him until it didn't. The first sign was almost invisible, so small that no one else would have remembered it later. No warning sound, no visible mistake, no dramatic shift in the pace of his day. Just one detail, placed inside the flow of a normal decision that did not behave the way it should have. Victor noticed it immediately, because that's what he always did. And this time, when he turned his attention toward it, something unexpected happened. He couldn't explain it. Control didn't begin with success, it started long before anyone knew Victor Hale's name. Before the office, before the company, before the structure people would later admire, it started with observation. Victor noticed things early, not dramatic things, small ones. The kind most people overlook. A delay that didn't need to happen. A conversation that went in the wrong direction. A decision made too quickly or too late. He began to see a pattern. Problems didn't appear suddenly. They developed, step by step, quietly. One small mistake followed another, one unclear decision leading into the next. And by the time the problem became visible, it was already too late to stop it easily. Most people reacted at that stage. Victor didn't want to. He wanted to understand what came before. So he started paying attention to sequences. What happened first? What followed? What changed the outcome? He didn't study it in theory. He watched it happen in real situations. At school, at work, in conversations, everywhere. And once he saw the sequence clearly, he realized something important. And if you interrupt the sequence early enough, you don't have to deal with the problem later. That idea stayed with him. It shaped how he thought, how he made decisions, how he moved through situations others found unpredictable. While most people focused on results, Victor focused on process, because results can be misleading. They only show you what happened. Process shows you why. And once you understand why, you can influence what happens next. As he moved into business, that mindset became more valuable. He saw the same patterns again, but this time at scale. Companies didn't collapse overnight. They weakened slowly. A misaligned team, an unclear responsibility, a decision made without enough information. None of it looked serious at first, but over time, those small issues connected. And when they did, the outcome became difficult to reverse. Victor didn't accept that as normal. He began making changes, not dramatic ones, not changes that would draw attention. He focused on structure, clarity. He made sure people understood their roles, not broadly, precisely, what they were responsible for, what they were not responsible for, where their decisions began and where they ended. That alone removed a surprising amount of confusion, because most inefficiency doesn't come from lack of effort. It comes from lack of clarity. People hesitate when they're unsure. They duplicate work when responsibilities overlap. They delay decisions when ownership is unclear. Victor eliminated that, step by step. He simplified processes, not by removing complexity entirely, but by organizing it, breaking it down into clear sequences. What happens first? What follows next? What must be completed before moving forward? That made work easier to navigate. People no longer had to guess. They knew where they were in the process. They knew what came next. And because of that, they moved faster, more confidently, more accurately. Victor didn't try to control people directly. He understood something better. People respond to environment. If the environment is unclear, people become inconsistent. If the environment is structured, people become precise. So he built an environment that supported precision. Meetings followed a clear format. No wandering discussions. No unnecessary input. If something didn't contribute to the decision, it didn't stay in the room. At first it felt different, more focused, more deliberate, but over time it became normal. People adapted. They arrived prepared. They spoke with intention. They thought before they responded. Because the environment demanded it. And when the environment demands clarity, people either adjust or they leave. Victor didn't force that outcome. He allowed it. Those who aligned with the system stayed. Those who didn't last long enough to matter. That's how consistency is built, not through pressure, through alignment. If something didn't align, Victor didn't react emotionally. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't create tension for effect. He asked questions, clear ones, focused ones, questions that made the problem visible, and once the problem was visible, it became easier to fix. That approach removed something most workplaces rely on: repetition. He didn't need to remind people of the same mistake again and again, because once they understood it clearly, they didn't repeat it. That saved time, it preserved energy, and it made the system stronger. Over time, the company began to reflect that structure. Communication improved, decisions became faster, mistakes became less frequent. Not because people stopped making them, because they caught them earlier. That's where Victor's system was most effective, not in preventing problems entirely, but in identifying them before they could grow. And when problems are small, they're easy to correct. That's how his company maintained stability. While others reacted, he anticipated. While others adjusted late, he adjusted early. That difference created momentum. Projects moved without unnecessary delays. Decisions didn't stall. Opportunities weren't missed because of hesitation. Everything progressed, with intention. But there was another layer to how Victor operated, something less visible. He understood the value of information. Not just having it, controlling how it moved. He didn't speak unless it mattered. He didn't fill silence just to be heard. He let others talk. And when they did, they revealed more than they intended. People are uncomfortable with silence. They try to fill it. They explain more. They justify. They add details that weren't asked for. Victor listened, carefully. He paid attention to what was said and what wasn't. And when he responded, he kept it precise. No unnecessary words, no long explanations. Just enough to guide the direction. That made him difficult to read, and very effective. In negotiations, he didn't push aggressively. He didn't try to dominate the room. He positioned outcomes. He asked the right questions, presented the right options, allowed others to move toward a conclusion. That aligned with his. Because when someone believes a decision is their own, they commit to it fully. Victor understood that, so he didn't force agreement. He created it. That approach extended his influence, even when he wasn't present. Decisions made across the company began to reflect his thinking. Processes continued to function without constant oversight. People operated within the structure he had built. That's when a system becomes powerful, when it no longer depends on constant supervision, when it continues on its own. At that point, control becomes less visible. It doesn't look like control, it looks natural, like things are simply working the way they should. And when things feel natural, people stop questioning them. That applied to everyone, inside the company, outside the company, and eventually to Victor himself. Because everything worked, every decision produced a result he could trace, every outcome had a clear explanation. Nothing appeared without a cause, nothing behaved unpredictably. That consistency shaped his expectations. He didn't assume things would go wrong. He assumed they wouldn't. Not because he was careless, because his experience had taught him that his system worked. And when something works repeatedly, you begin to trust it completely. You stop looking for what might be missing. You focus on what you already understand. Victor trusted his system, because up to that point, it had always been enough. The first sign didn't look serious, it didn't interrupt anything, and the day continued the way it always did. Meetings were completed, decisions were made, nothing appeared out of place. But something was different. It happened during a routine decision. One Victor had made many times before, the kind that usually required very little thought. The information was complete, the process was familiar. The expected outcome was clear. So he made the decision, the same way he always did. Without hesitation. The result came back later that day. At first glance, it looked acceptable. Nothing alarming, nothing that would draw attention. But when Victor looked at it more closely, he noticed the difference. It wasn't what he expected. Not entirely. The outcome had shifted slightly, not enough to cause concern for anyone else, but enough for him. Victor didn't react immediately, and he leaned back in his chair and looked at the numbers again. Carefully, he went through the process step by step. What information had been used, what assumptions had been made, what sequence had been followed. Everything was in place, nothing missing, nothing out of order. The decision itself was correct, the logic behind it held, and yet, the result didn't match. Victor didn't dismiss it, but he didn't escalate it either, because one variation doesn't define a pattern. He made a note of it, not written down, stored mentally, and moved on. The rest of the day continued normally. Other decisions were made, other results came in. Everything aligned again. By the end of the day, there was no visible problem. That should have been enough. For most people, it would have been. But Victor didn't think in isolated moments. He thought in sequences, and once something enters a sequence, it becomes part of it, even if it doesn't repeat immediately. The next morning began like every other. Same routine, same pace, same structure. Nothing suggested that anything had changed. Victor approached the day with the same clarity, the same control, but somewhere in the back of his mind, that moment remained, not as a concern, as a question, a small one, but present. Later that day, another decision came forward. Different context, different data, different people involved, but the process was the same, structured, clear, reliable. Victor reviewed the information, made the decision, moved forward. The result came in hours later, and again, something shifted, not dramatically, not enough to disrupt the outcome completely, but enough to notice. This time, and Victor didn't move on as quickly, he paused, not outwardly, internally. He compared the two moments, different situations, no shared variables, no obvious connection, but the same type of difference, a result that didn't fully align. That was enough, not to panic, to investigate. Victor closed the file in front of him and started again. From the beginning, he broke the process down into smaller steps, examined each one independently, what information entered the system, how it was processed, where decisions were made, what influenced those decisions. He checked the timing, the sequence, the dependencies, everything held. There were no gaps, no errors, no overlooked detail. The system had functioned exactly as designed, and still, the outcome didn't match. That was new, not because something had gone wrong, because nothing had, but because something existed that the system didn't account for. Victor didn't accept that immediately. He repeated the process. From a different angle, he questioned assumptions, not broadly, specifically. What if something had been interpreted differently? What if timing had affected the result? What if there was an external variable? He tested each possibility, one by one, carefully. Nothing explained it. No clear cause, no consistent pattern, just two moments. That didn't align. Victor sat back. Still, calm, but focused. This wasn't enough to change anything yet, but it was enough to stay with him. He didn't make adjustments immediately, because adjustments require understanding, and understanding wasn't there yet. So he did what he always did. He observed. Over the next few days, everything returned to normal, decisions aligned, outcomes matched expectations. The system continued to function. That should have resolved it. Two irregular moments, then stability, but Victor didn't forget. Because once something happens more than once, it stops being accidental. It becomes possible. And possibility requires attention. The third time it happened, he was ready. Another decision, another routine process, another expected outcome. Victor followed it closely, from the beginning. He paid attention to every detail, not just the final result, the entire sequence. And when the result came in, there it was again. Slight, contained, but undeniable. Not wrong, just not exact. Victor didn't need more confirmation. 3 moments were enough. This wasn't random. It wasn't noise. It wasn't something that could be ignored. It was something real, in something that existed within the system, without being explained by it. That realization didn't create panic. Victor wasn't the type to react that way. But it did something else. It shifted his focus. Before, he operated with certainty. Now, he operated with awareness. There was something he didn't fully understand, and that changed how he approached everything that followed. He didn't stop making decisions. He didn't slow everything down, but he started paying closer attention to details he would normally trust, to outcomes he would normally accept, to processes he had never needed to question before, because now there was a reason to question them, and that reason didn't go away. Victor didn't lose control, not in the way most people would expect. Nothing collapsed, nothing stopped working. From the outside, everything still moved forward. Meetings continued, decisions were made, results came in. If someone observed him, they wouldn't see a problem. But internally, things had changed. Before, every decision followed a clean path: start, process, conclusion. No hesitation, no second pass. No need to revisit anything once it was done. Now, there was a pause, small, almost invisible, but consistent. After each decision, Victor looked again, not because he doubted himself, because he no longer assumed the outcome was complete. That difference mattered. He started reviewing results more closely, not just what happened, but how it happened. He looked at timing, at sequence, at the conditions surrounding each decision. He wasn't searching randomly. He was narrowing possibilities, trying to find what the system had missed. Most of the time, everything aligned. But that wasn't enough anymore, because most of the time was not how Victor operated. He needed certainty, and certainty had started to slip. So he adjusted. Quietly, he introduced more checks, more structure around decisions that had once been simple, not visible to others, but present in his process. A decision that once took one step, now took two. A result that once ended the process, now required confirmation. That added time, not enough to slow everything down, but enough to change the rhythm. Victor noticed that control was no longer effortless. It required more attention, more energy, more involvement. That was new. He didn't resist it. He adapted. Meetings began to shift. Still structured, still efficient, but more exact. Victor asked more questions, not more words, more precision, on questions that tested clarity, questions that removed assumption. People felt the difference, not as pressure, as expectation. There was less room for approximation, less tolerance for close enough. Everything needed to be defined, because undefined details had started to matter. Victor began reviewing work personally, not because others were failing, because he needed direct visibility. He wanted to see the process himself, from start to finish. That created another shift. Time. He was now involved in things he had already delegated, not constantly, but more often. Enough to feel it. The system still functioned, but it no longer carried the same weight on its own. Victor was holding more of it, and that came with a cost. Not failure, not breakdown, effort, sustained effort. If you've been following this closely, I comment control below. I want to see who's really paying attention. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. The inconsistencies didn't disappear. They didn't become more frequent either. They remained unpredictable, occasional, unclear, and that made them harder to isolate. Because you can't correct something if you don't know where it begins. Victor tried to define it. He approached it the same way he approached everything. Methodically. He tested timing. Was the delay affecting outcomes? No. He tested information. Was something missing? No. He tested people. Was human error involved? Not consistently. Each possibility was examined, and each one failed to explain the pattern. That narrowed the problem, but it didn't solve it, which meant something else was true. The system was working, and still, it wasn't complete. Victor didn't accept that easily. He pushed further. He tightened the system again, removed flexibility, reduced variation, made processes more exact. If something existed outside the structure, this would expose it. But it didn't. The results remained the same, stable, predictable, and still, not fully explainable. That's when something shifted, not in the system, in Victor. Before he trusted the system completely. Now he observed it, closely, continuously. Not just what it produced, how it behaved. He started noticing things he had never needed to notice before. The way decisions formed, the moment a conclusion felt complete, the subtle difference between confidence and assumption. That awareness changed the experience. Before, everything flowed. Now everything required attention. Every decision carried weight. Not because it was risky, because it needed confirmation. Victor could still operate at the same level, still make effective decisions, still maintain structure, but it no longer felt the same. Control had changed, not externally. Internally, it was no longer automatic, it was maintained. And maintaining something is different from relying on it. The system still worked, but Victor no longer believed it was absolute. And once that belief changes, everything that depends on it begins to feel different. Victor didn't stop. He didn't walk away from the company. He didn't tear apart the system he had spent years building, because nothing had failed in a way the world could see. From the outside, his life still looked the same. The company continued to move forward. Meetings still happened on time. Decisions still produced results. And the structure still held. If someone looked at Victor from a distance, they would have seen the same man. Composed, measured, controlled. But distance hides a lot. What had changed was not the system itself. It was Victor's relationship with it. Before, the system gave him certainty. That was what made it so powerful. It wasn't just efficient. It was explainable. Every result had a cause. Every cause could be traced. Every decision could be understood. That was the part he relied on most. Not the outcome alone, the ability to explain it. That ability had always given him confidence. Because once you understand why something works, you trust it more. You repeat it. You build on it. You stop second-guessing it. That had been the foundation of Victor's life, not luck, not instinct, understanding. Now that foundation had changed, and he could still produce results, still make good decisions, still maintain structure, but there were moments he could no longer fully account for. Small moments, contained moments, but real ones, and once they were real, they changed everything around them. Not because they destroyed his system, because they changed what he believed the system could do. Victor no longer expected complete certainty. That was the shift, not failure, not collapse, adjustment. He stopped trying to force a perfect explanation for every irregularity. Not because he stopped caring, because he had already gone as far as his method could take him. He had reviewed the process, tightened the structure, tested the variables, watched the outcomes, and still something remained outside of full definition. That did not mean his system was useless. It meant his system had limits. That idea would have been difficult for Victor to accept before, not because he was arrogant, because he had never needed to think that way. When something works for long enough, you stop wondering where it ends. You assume it doesn't. Victor had built a life around that assumption. Now he had to reconsider it, carefully, quietly, without drama, because that is how real change usually happens. Not through one moment, through repeated evidence, through an idea becoming harder and harder to ignore. Victor still kept the same routine, still moved through his days with structure, still protected his time, still filtered noise, still made decisions with care, but he no longer moved with the same kind of certainty. There was a new layer beneath it. Awareness, not fear, not confusion. Awareness. The awareness that some things do not become clearer just because you look at them longer. Some things do not reveal themselves simply because the system is strong. Some things remain unresolved, and being unresolved does not make them unreal. That was the part he had to learn. Victor's system could still do what it had always done. It could organize, it could reduce chaos, it could create better outcomes, it could make decisions more reliable, it could protect him from obvious disorder, but it could not guarantee total understanding. And once he saw that clearly, he stopped treating control as something absolute. He started treating it as something practical, useful, powerful, necessary, but limited. That changed him, subtly. He became less interested in perfect certainty, more interested in resilience, less focused on removing every variable, more focused on remaining steady when one remained unresolved. That's a different kind of control, a quieter one, the kind that doesn't depend on knowing everything, only on knowing enough to continue. If this story made you think differently about control, let me know in the comments. And subscribe to Velvet Plot Studios for more stories like this. Victor didn't become careless. He didn't lower his standards. He didn't start leaving things to chance. He remained who he was. But he was no longer operating under the same illusion. That illusion had been simple. If the structure is strong enough, nothing escapes it. Now he knew that wasn't true. Some things do, not often, not loudly, but enough to matter. And once they matter, they change the meaning of everything built around them. That is what happened to Victor Hale. He did not lose control. He lost the belief that control was complete. And in some ways, that made him more dangerous than before. Because a person who believes in perfect systems can be broken by the first thing they cannot explain. A person who understands limits becomes harder to shake. Victor no longer needed the illusion. He no longer expected the world to fit entirely inside his understanding of it. He accepted that there would always be a line, a point where analysis stops, a point where structure ends, a point where certainty no longer follows. That line did not defeat him, but it stayed with him, in meetings, in decisions, in the silence that followed a finished thought, in the pause between outcome and interpretation. It became part of how he saw things, not as failure, as boundary. Oh, and boundaries matter, because they tell you where your power ends. Victor Hale still controlled everything he could: his time, his environment, his decisions, his discipline, his process, his response. But there was one thing he could no longer claim: complete certainty. And once that disappears, control becomes something else. Not weaker, more honest. That is where the story ends. Not with collapse, not with ruin, not with a dramatic loss, but with recognition. The recognition that even the most carefully built system cannot explain everything. The recognition that order has limits, the recognition that power does not come from removing uncertainty completely, but from continuing to move with direction, even when uncertainty remains. That was the final lesson Victor Hale had to learn. Not everything can be predicted, or not everything can be defined, and not everything was ever meant to be controlled. He still controlled everything he could, except what he could no longer explain. Subscribe to Velvet Plot Studios for more stories like this.